John Whitman, a 45-year-old American billionaire, was known for his fortune and his successful investments in Silicon Valley. However, after years of wealth and luxury, he began to question the true value of life and the people around him. He felt disconnected from reality and surrounded by falseness. Determined to understand what it was like to live without his wealth, he disguised himself as a simple man, changing his appearance and abandoning his luxurious attire. His plan? To live as a poor man for a while in search of answers. He finds the house of an elderly woman, Mrs. Wilson, in a suburb of San Francisco, and rents her garage for a symbolic price. Mrs. Wilson, a 70-year-old widow, is kind but lives with financial difficulties. John, disguised as Jack. "Good afternoon, Mom. I'm Jack. So I heard you rent out the garage. I'm looking for a place to stay for a while." Mrs. Wilson, with a tired smile. "Oh, sure, my son. Life has been hard, and a little extra money helps. The garage isn't much, but you can stay if you want." The garage was modest with little space, but John accepted immediately. Even amidst simplicity, he began to form a bond with Mrs. Wilson, who, unaware of his true identity, treated him like family. As the days passed, John, now living as Jack, began to get closer to Mrs. Wilson. He saw the difficulties she faced. Her retirement barely covered the expenses, and the loneliness weighed on her heart. Mrs. Wilson often mentioned her son, who lived in another state but rarely visited her. Jack found himself touched by the elderly woman's generosity, who, even with so little, always did her best to ensure he was comfortable. Mrs. Wilson, while preparing a cup of tea for Jack, "You know, Jack, I never thought that at 70 years old, I would be alone and have to rent out the garage to survive. But God always finds a way, and you showed up." Jack, with a sincere tone, "You shouldn't be going through this. You worked your whole life, you deserve to rest." Gradually, John began to realize that his disguise was revealing more than he had expected. He was not only learning about the simple life, but also witnessing the impact that a lack of opportunities and social abandonment could have on someone like Mrs. Wilson. He saw the elderly woman sacrificing the little she had for him, a stranger. At the same time, John was also facing his own dilemmas. He began to question whether wealth truly had value if it couldn't be used to help others. On the other hand, keeping his secret was becoming harder each day, especially because Mrs. Wilson treated him like a son, while he hid his true identity and fortune. One afternoon, John decided to help Mrs. Wilson in a discreet way. He started fixing things around the house, such as the old plumbing and faded paint, using the few tools he had. Mrs. Wilson was grateful, without imagining that the poor man fixing her house was actually a billionaire. Mrs. Wilson, admiring Jack's work. "You have golden hands, Jack. I don't know what I would do without you around here." Jack, hesitating but moved. "I just want to give back for what you've done for me." The days went by, and the bond between them deepened. But something began to stir the elderly woman's curiosity. One day, while organizing some old belongings, Mrs. Wilson found an economics magazine in which John appeared on the cover in an article about the top investors in the United States. When Mrs. Wilson found the magazine, she was perplexed. She recognized John's face, or rather Jack's. It was the same man who was living in her garage. The shock was immediate. That night, while John was in the garage, Mrs. Wilson entered with the magazine in her hands, visibly emotional and confused. Mrs. Wilson, with a trembling voice, "Jackie, or should I say John, what is happening here? Why are you a billionaire living in my garage?" Jack, caught by surprise, sighed deeply before responding, "I didn't want you to know, not yet. I needed a break, a chance to see what really matters in life. I thought that living as an ordinary person would give me the answers I was looking for." Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears. She felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and compassion. Mrs. Wilson, hurt. "But why deceive me? Why lie to me?" John, with his eyes downcast, I didn't know I would become so involved with you. The truth is, you made me realize that wealth means nothing if it's not used to do something good." After the revelation, there was a tense silence between John and Mrs. Wilson. She withdrew to her room, still processing everything, while John stayed in the garage, reflecting on what had happened. For the first time, he felt afraid of losing the friendship of that woman, who, without knowing who he really was, gave him support and care. The next day, John decided he could no longer live in a lie. He went to Mrs. Wilson's front door and knocked softly. "John, sincerely, I know you are hurt, and you have every right to be. I shouldn't have lied. But the truth is, you showed me something that money can't buy: humanity and kindness. If you allow me, I would like to make amends for what I did." Mrs. Wilson, her eyes still filled with emotion, opened the door slowly. Mrs. Wilson, in a soft voice, "Jack or John, I don't know who you are anymore, but I can't deny that you have been good to me. I just wanted to understand why someone with so much money would feel the need to hide like this." John, with a deep tone, "I was lost. Success and wealth drove me away from the things that matter. I was surrounded by people who only cared about what I could offer financially. I just wanted to know what it was like to be normal." Mrs. Wilson took a deep breath and finally smiled, even if slightly. Mrs. Wilson says, "Well, I'm not a woman who holds grudges. If you're willing to be honest from now on, we can move forward." John moved, promised never to hide the truth from her again. He knew he now needed to use his fortune for something greater than his own satisfaction. With the truth exposed and trust rebuilt, John decided it was time to repay Mrs. Wilson's generosity in a meaningful way. He realized that his wealth could change lives, and the first person he truly wanted to help was her. One morning, he invited her for a walk in downtown San Francisco. As they walked through the streets, John stopped in front of an old store, a modest property, but with great potential. He held Mrs. Wilson's hands and looked into her eyes with seriousness. John, in a firm voice, "Mrs. Wilson, this store is yours. I bought it for you. I want you to have the chance to fulfill a dream, to live with comfort and independence. Here you can open whatever you want without ever worrying about money again." Mrs. Wilson was speechless. She looked at the building and then at John, her eyes welling up with emotion. For a moment, it seemed like she didn't know whether to smile or cry. Mrs. Wilson, with tears streaming down, I don't even know what to say, Jack or John or whoever you are now, but I know my heart is full of gratitude. I never thought anyone would do this for me." John hugged her, moved, feeling that he was finally doing something truly valuable with his wealth. The moment was one of redemption for him, who had always believed that money only brought superficiality, but now saw that it could be a tool for kindness and transformation. With the new venture in hand, Mrs. Wilson opened a tea and craft store, something she had always dreamed of doing but never had the resources for. The store quickly became a gathering spot in the neighborhood, bringing life and joy to the community. Mrs. Wilson now had a new reason to wake up every day with a smile on her face, surrounded by people, and with her heart full of purpose. John continued visiting the store, no longer as Jack but as a close friend and confidant. He had discovered that his wealth could truly change lives, and decided to use his fortune to help other people like Mrs. Wilson, creating a fund to support elderly and low-income small entrepreneurs. Mrs. Wilson, on a busy day at the store, looked at John with gratitude. "You didn't just change my life, John. You changed the way I see people. I would never have imagined that such a rich man could have such a generous heart." John, smiling, "And you changed mine, Mrs. Wilson. You showed me that the true value of a person is not in their bank account, but in what they do for others." They hugged, and at that moment it was clear that both had found more than a successful business. They had found a friendship and a purpose that no money in the world could buy. Months passed since the opening of the store, and Mrs. Wilson's life was fuller of joy and purpose than ever. The store thrived, and the neighborhood revitalized around it. People came not only for the teas, but to hear Mrs. Wilson's stories and her special relationship with John. He, in turn, continued to be discreet but active in his new initiatives, helping to transform other lives with his fortune. John had left behind the superficial world of business to become an investor with a purpose. He founded a non-profit organization that supported low-income people, helping them to start small businesses and live with dignity. His reputation in the business world changed completely. Now he was known as the people's investor, someone who used his fortune for good. John, reflecting at a charity event, spoke to the audience. True wealth is not in the numbers of a bank account, but in the lives we touch. I discovered this thanks to an incredible woman who, without knowing it, taught me the value of humility and generosity. Mrs. Wilson was in the audience, applauding with pride. Her eyes shone, knowing that she had not only gained a friend, but also helped transform a billionaire into a true human being. What an inspiring story. John's journey shows us that, even with all the success and fortune, the true value of life is in helping and transforming the world around us. The lesson that money only has value when used for good is something we can all carry forward. Share in the comments which part of this story touched your heart the most and why. Mrs. Wilson and John showed us the power of friendship and generosity, which go far beyond appearances or money. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel Inspired Stories for more touching accounts like this. Your support is essential for us to continue spreading these messages that touch the heart. Do you know someone who needs to hear this message? Share this story with friends and family and help inspire more people with this example of kindness and transformation. Stay tuned. In the next video, we will explore an even more emotional and impactful story that will touch your heart. Don't miss it. We would love to hear your opinion. Leave a comment telling us how you connected with the story of John and Mrs. Wilson. Your words could be the inspiration someone needs. Subscribe now to our channel Inspired Stories and activate the bell to not miss any of our exciting and transformative stories. Thank you for watching and for being part of our channel. See you in the next video. Until then,